time now for Chain Breakers, where we're going to talk with the top voices in the blockchain and digital assets ecosystem. We're joined now by Bruce Fenton, CEO and founder of Atlantic Financial, Chainstone Labs, and the Satoshi Roundtable Retreats, to discuss the latest news and events from across the cryptosphere. Bruce, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so kicking us off this week, I suppose we could call it the first thing to put a fire under the belly of the cryptosphere in 2020. This is the launch of Nakamoto.com by Balaji Srinivasan, the former CTO of Coinbase, now taking on this project, getting some of the biggest names in the sphere for what they say is a more philosophical, cultural, technical, academic set of writings across the space. But it's already caused controversy. It's already stirred up some across the sphere. Bruce, what's your take on Nakamoto.com?
I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was one of the most fascinating conversations I've seen in the space in a while, because it covered a lot of issues. It's it's a complex space. This technology is complex. Economics are complex. There's political ideas and ideologies involved, and there's people and personalities. So it's very multidimensional. And personally, I like to assume everybody is good until proven otherwise. I certainly understand people who are cautious and skeptical. There is a lot of bad actors in this space. Some of the more vocal people in these kind of arguments really believe this is a war. They really believe this is war and peace, and this technology is something that's going to make the world a better place, and that there are powerful actors who are fighting against it. So I understand both sides, and I've always tried to understand different opinions and be friends with people on all sides of these kind of issues. So I thought it was really fascinating.
Do you worry at all, Bruce, that with a project like this, I suppose it could risk usurping some of the qualities of the space, as it were? In particular, there have been a number of criticisms that have come out in regards to the use of the Nakamoto name in this project, saying that it gives it a sense of affiliation that the project doesn't legitimately have. Is so I suppose IP of Satoshi Nakamoto up for anyone and all to grab? Is it truly decentralized, or should there be some limitation on the use and of that particular nomenclature?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've had a similar issue because we have the Satoshi Roundtable, and actually when that was named 7 years ago, it wasn't really a controversial term. It was thought of as sort of abstract, like sats in your account. And if I had it to do over again, I probably wouldn't have used that name because it is sort of controversial. I don't want to feel like we're speaking for Satoshi. But in the case of Nakamoto, I certainly wouldn't discourage somebody else from using that name. I think that they've explained it, that they feel that Satoshi Nakamoto was very open to other ideas and wasn't combative. My take on it would be also that, whether you like it or not, Satoshi created not just Bitcoin, but this technology. And so a lot of these distributed ledger projects, Ethereum, certainly Bitcoin Cash, certainly Monero, certainly Litecoin, but really this entire ecosystem, including this program and everything that we talk about, really exists because of Satoshi Nakamoto. So, that's another way to look at it. He or she is sort of this, creator figure of this entire industry.
And when you fall, Bruce, when it comes to the issue of maximalism and toxicity here, because one of the big things that come along with this project was the establishment of an adjacent Telegram group, which was immediately booting out some people that were named as toxic or maximalist in their thinking, and they were seen as being sort of not fit for the sort of enlightened discussion the group was supposedly aiming for. It led to a bit of a storm on Twitter with the hashtag ProBTC trending within the crypto space. And others came back and argued that when you've got a situation like this where you've got players such as Vitalik Buterin or Roger Ver, being part of this Nakamoto project, how can you say that you're pro-BTC, which is a claim that they make on the website? A lot of moving parts in this, Bruce, but ultimately, do you think that sort of approach to the sort of toxic talk and maximalism is problematic?
Yeah, I think that it's worth it for people to discuss where they come from. People should say, if you feel you're toxic, you should say that. At least the other person knows kind of where you're coming from. And and also where you stand, whether you're in support of a coin or not. So it's sort of two axis. It's how combative you are. And I don't mean toxic in necessarily a negative way. There are times it might make sense to be toxic if you truly feel that your family's being threatened, or you feel that there's you're defending against violence, or if you're really, really big supporter of Bitcoin and you genuinely believe that somebody is truly trying to destroy or co-opt it, that might be a very good time to be toxic. So it really depends. It's conditional. And then your support of a coin, that's a judgment call. Somebody could say, I'm a supporter of Bitcoin, and then do something that other people don't agree with. But at least we have a common ground of where we're coming from. I think it would be useful if people sort of state where they're coming from a little bit more. You can still disagree, but at least kind of there's so many access to this. If you knew a little bit more about where people were coming from, you might be able to see through their eyes a little bit better.
There's certainly a chance to walk a mile in another's shoes and have a bit more empathy across the space, maybe something that could help to reduce some of the more unhealthy toxicity. Although, as you say, it can be healthy, it can be unhealthy, depending on how it plays out. But okay, Bruce, I want to turn now to talk about another important topic for 2020 as the year starts, new trends form. We have to see how people from all walks of life are going to start playing things out, and none more importantly than the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which has released its 2020 priorities for crypto, nicely summed up in a tweet by Catherine Wu. But what do you see as significant in this, and do you think there's a positive trend for the SEC coming into the future?
I think it's somewhat positive in that the SEC has a long history of being pro-business. One criticism of the SEC at certain points in history has been that they're almost too close with Wall Street. But either way, they have been pretty pro-business in many ways. They certainly don't want to squash capital markets. Unfortunately, our regulations are so far behind on things like accredited investor rules and crowdfunding and just the way that how difficult it is to be a publicly traded company. That's a drawback, but that's not really the SEC's fault, certainly not the current SEC management, because many of these rules have been around for decades, in some cases 70 or 80 years. As far as their comments, I think they've always been very consistent all along about this technology, and I think that's the other thing that's fairly positive. Although I'd love to see them just start stripping down a lot more of these regulations that I think are anti-business. I think that given what they have, they've been pretty consistent about being clear about what laws they're going to enforce. Security laws have been around for 75 years. They're not going anywhere anytime soon, and crypto is going to be subject to those laws. And that's been, I think, pretty clear from the SEC for the last few years. And I think they've actually, in many cases, been pretty friendly to the industry, given a couple companies a pass or relatively light penalties in order to sort of get this going. But they are very, very clear about it. A security is a definable thing. Many of these instruments are securities, and there's certain things you can't do with securities. Like if you sell them, you have to comply with certain laws. And if you're acting as a broker, you have to be a registered SEC licensed broker, and so on. So I think they've been pretty consistent, and I'd love to see a lot less regulation, but that's more of a congressional kind of thing than an SEC sort of thing.
Do you think, Bruce, that the Howey test, put forward in the 1940s, that still sort of suggests, shapes so much of this conversation? People have called it irrelevant. They said that any legislation from the 40s is incapable of understanding the complex financial environment we live in today. But that test fundamentally looks at substance over name or label when it comes to determining whether something's a security. Arguably, by some, even more relevant today than it used to be. Do you think the SEC is giving a fair application of the laws as they stand? And do you think, as some others have suggested, that the Howey test and others need to be updated for this 21st century economy we're living in?
Yeah, I understand the opinion of the people who say that. I've been in securities my whole life, so I have maybe a little bit more granular view. I would step back a little bit. I don't think it's so much Howey that's the problem. The reason people ask that question is because they want to avoid being a security. So they're looking for a way, many cases, they're looking for a way to classify as utility or something else so they can avoid being considered a security. And from that standpoint, yeah, Howey's pretty comprehensive, and Howey's only a piece of the regulations. That's only one way, the investment contract point of the overall regulations. There's a lot of other ways that you can fall under the definition of security. What I would say is what is outdated is the entire application of these laws. What I would like to see is a world where you could say, yeah, sure, I'm a security, no big deal. Here's how I comply. And it's a matter of spending some number of hours and maybe a couple $1,000s online, clicking some forms, and you've complied. That would be reasonable. I mean, if you think about it, where do we come out in this world? Whoever had the idea that it should cost, 100, 200, 500,000, $1 million in legal work to get something done in the United States, that just doesn't make any sense. I get protecting investors, but it's very, very, very complex. And those are the kind of things I'd like to see, a world where people don't care if they're classified as a security. They don't mind if they're subject to Howey, because there's a lot of good things about securities. You can share profits, you can have pieces of equity, you can do bonds. These things are good instruments that have built our capital markets. The solution isn't to make it so less things are security. I'd like to see everything be a security and have everything be easy and tradable. But what we should do is have regulations that support that and make it so that you could be security, even a publicly traded company. I mean, wouldn't it be great if you could be a publicly traded company for, $50,000 instead of $1 million? There'd be a lot more public companies. There'd be a lot more money floating around, a lot more opportunities for investors, a lot more capital in the markets. It would be a win-win for everybody.
Certainly a lot of potential for change in those remarks there. But I want to talk now about something that is more imminently on our doorstep, Bruce, that of a potential conflict, a rise of tensions, depending on how you want to characterize it, between the United States and Iran, which peaked so far last night with a barrage of missiles being fired at US bases in Iraq. This seems to have caused a flight to safety by many investors across the markets. We've seen oil, gold, and indeed Bitcoin surge, and the crypto markets as a whole surge over the last 24 hours, with potentially more yet to come in terms of wars or conflicts or even just increased tensions and lack of security. Do you think this trend will continue, and do you think Bitcoin can validate itself as a safe haven asset?
That's interesting. We were talking about it by email earlier, and I think I said I don't think that it's correlated, but the real answer is I don't know. Nobody can know for sure. I still probably don't think it is, but I'm more in the last 24, 48 hours, I've become more on the side that, yeah, it could be correlated. And sometimes these things are self-fulfilling prophecies. If enough people talk about it and say, hey, it's a flight to quality, and then people see it, people are very fickle. Even high-level institutional traders, if they see a few 5% up days, especially if other assets are down, and they see a narrative where a lot of people are talking about this being a flight to quality, yeah, it sort of becomes true. And that's what's fascinating about money and free and open markets. On a bigger picture, is it truly a flight to safety? I don't think so yet. Bitcoin and most things in our world are fiat priced, and Bitcoin is still volatile in fiat terms. However, the way that this can start and be very positive for Bitcoin is if gold definitely is a flight to quality, always has been, as long as I've been in the business, and many decades before that, or centuries before that, I suppose. And if gold bugs, and people who believe that, especially Wall Street traders and investment allocators, believe that, and they say, okay, I'm going to go to a flight to quality, I'm putting a little bit in gold, and I'm also going to put a smaller piece into Bitcoin as well, well, that's very, very bullish for Bitcoin. That's kind of the dream of people who believe in Bitcoin as global money would like to see. If people start thinking like that, then that's a very, very good path for Bitcoin to get much wider global adoption and truly be considered a global money by a lot more people.
Global money, perhaps. And do you think there's any chance in the near, I don't need to put a time frame on it, but in the near future, let's just say that Bitcoin could threaten gold's primacy as the safe haven asset of the world? Do you think there's a chance that that is on the cards, particularly if we start seeing an increase in either tensions in this conflict or another, or even just a general economic downturn? Do you think people could start to see Bitcoin in that sort of light more securely?
It's certainly possible. The first thing I say is Bitcoin is very risky and speculative. And even though I talk about it all of the time, I talk about it 90% of my time, it probably shouldn't be 90% of most portfolios. It typically, for your average investor, should not be in a portfolio, or should be a very, very small piece of the risk portion that they can afford to lose. But having said that, sure, there is a part of the reason it is so risky is because it does have a upside potential, which has worked in the past. But again, that's no guarantee of the future. It could go down to zero. You could lose everything you put into it. But it is possible for sure that it could do quite well. And there's this concept called hyper-Bitcoinization. In hyper-Bitcoinization, you get to a point where Bitcoin starts rallying. We almost could see what it might have looked like a couple of years ago. Bitcoin starts rallying, and then people get FOMO, and then enough people jump in and say, boy, maybe this is real money, that it kind of, sort of a bigger version of what I was talking about earlier, becomes self-fulfilling. And then people start leaving other forms of money to get into Bitcoin, which then, further helps Bitcoin and causes a crash in the others. That's a big and epic, sort of dream scenario, very far-fetched is what many economists would call it, but it's certainly possible. And I think it's possible it could be in a small scale. It could just be that all of a sudden Bitcoin becomes a top 20 global currency. That's a very doable thing. And, there's a lot of, potential volatility along the way, but, that kind of concept could definitely happen. It would be very exciting. And then you see the advantages that it has over gold. It's easier to move, it's digital, it's more suited for the future DeFi economy and securities tokens and these kind of things.
Yeah, certainly a big potential there. We'll have to see if now or in the near future is the chance to fulfill that. Bruce Fenton, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on today, an auspicious week already in 2020, much more yet to come, and I look forward to continuing our conversations throughout the year. But in the meantime, for those at home, stay with us at blocktv.com for all the latest in news and information. I'm Asher Westrop Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.